Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. My guest today is a man who's been making headlines since Sunday night. On August the 1st, of course, he will assume his role as the acting police minister. But we're not just going to be talking about, obviously, what he has been doing over the last few years, but we're going to talk about his family history. Of course, the Cachalia name is, of course, synonymous with the anti-apartheid struggle. And, of course, the professor has served on a number of positions, especially within the Gauteng government. I'm talking of none other than Professor Firoz Cachalia, who's my guest today on Talking Point. Prof, salams, thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Prof, first of all, congratulations. I know you only start on the 1st of August, but I want to touch on, obviously, your family history because it's very rich, very synonymous with the anti-apartheid struggle. Of course, when you joined, to fight the apartheid government, was there a pressure on yourself given that many members of your family were already involved, or was it more of like a seamless transition that you would join in and this would make it quite not just easy, but also that space for you to be part of the anti-apartheid struggle?
So for us, I just want to make the point that the anti-apartheid struggle involved, so many people, families, across many generations. So I think that should be borne in mind. In discussing the role, particularly of my family, I was surrounded by people in my family, in my community, in many communities who were oppressed by the apartheid system and who thirsted for freedom. So that's the environment I grew up in school, in Actonville, and so forth. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. I can't remember a time when growing up when I was not politically aware. I think I was probably somewhat precocious as a young boy, arguing with everyone that I could find in the family, with uncles, my grandfather. There was always discussion of the politics of the country at the family table, where my grandfather often presided, or, like a great patriarch. So that was the environment I grew up in. Even in the 1960s and 70s, when political conversation was, people were afraid of having discussion in public, worries about the police and security branch spies and so forth. But in the family environment, it was like a liberated zone. We discussed matters freely, and my parents, my grandparents, the extended family, the people that I grew up with in general, encouraged that conversation. And that interests me because I think that in a way there's a secret there in why the liberation movement, liberation struggle finally succeeded. Because even as we lived through repression, and it appeared as if the apartheid system was well entrenched, they had overwhelming power, the spirit of resistance, of rejection of the apartheid system always lived on. And I think that interests me, and I think that is the spirit that was revived in 1976, and from then on, the struggle just grew in momentum.
Professor, in the 70s and the 80s, you're of course active in student politics, and you of course get detained at that time. Was it then that you knew you are deep into the struggle as a youngster, as a a young lad that just wants to make a difference for the struggle against the National Party of that time?
Look, I was active on campus. I was active in the community, involved in many different kinds of organizations. Did a lot of community work, and of course involved in the Transvaal Indian Congress, in the UDF, in broad networks of people who were serious about the political struggle. And that included many, many people, as you know, in the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. This was a national network. So this is KwaZulu-Natal, isn't it? Your radio station?
No. We're based in Johannesburg, but of course nationally, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, in that period, the point I'm making is that there was a very dense network of organizations that came together in the UDF. There were people who were politically active across the country. So you know, and a lot of people, of course, being detained and banned, and growing repression, states of emergency, people being arrested under the Internal Security Act, and so forth. So yes, I was detained several times and banned and so forth, but I don't think my experience was in any way unique. What is important to understand is that generation that re-emerged in the 70s and 80s had the strategic acuity, the resilience, the determination across the country to fight for liberation. And I think it was that determination of that generation across racial communities, class forces and so forth, bringing people together across the country. You remember the slogan of the United Democratic Front was UDF Unites, Apartheid Divides. So this was a national movement. And I lived in and breathed that moment of high determination. People were very idealistic. They had very strong dreams about overcoming apartheid and establishing a free society. So, yeah, I want to emphasize being a part of that great movement.
Prof, one final question before we go to the break. Of course, the negotiations into democracy starts. You are representing the Transvaal Indian Congress at the time. This transition then from a student activist into a full-blown politician, how difficult was it? How easy was it for you to have this transition to say, this is now Firoz Cachalia, the actual student, becoming Firoz Cachalia, this politician that is sitting in the table to try and go ahead and negotiate democracy?
Yeah, I don't actually like the reference to politician, because at the time we were not thinking at all about political careers and positions in government and so forth. But that, of course, does come later. And so I don't want to avoid that question. When we go into CODESA, we're going in as part of the ANC's broad alliance, having come out of the UDF. So we were part of the internal forces in the country, the so-called MDM. I was appointed to represent the Transvaal Indian Congress, and I did so in Working Group 2, which dealt with constitutional matters. And then I think some of the movers and shakers, the real principals involved, people like Mac Maharaj and so forth, saw that I had a particular interest in the constitutional questions, and I was then put on the technical committee to support Working Group 2, which at the time was led by the late Justice Chaskelson and Difang Moseneke, and particularly, I think there were 4 or 5 of us. So I had the opportunity to learn, at the feet of these intellectual and judicial giants.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Firoz Cachalia. We're going to be discussing his roles with the Gauteng government, and of course starting when he became the Speaker of the Provincial Legislature from 1999 to 2004. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm in conversation with incoming Acting Police Minister, Professor Firoz Cachalia. Again, Prof, thank you so much for staying with us. Prof, you of course start off joining the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. I think the question that is always, asked and is always spoken about is this transition into democracy for an ANC government that has just, of course, taken power. And of course, there's a government of national unity at the time, the first one that occurred in 1994. How difficult of a job was it to try and make sure that after these years of apartheid, trust, number one, can be occurring between government and, of course, the residents of Gauteng, and number two, trying to get the work going in order to make sure that this transition of democracy is not only one of euphoria, but most importantly, the hard work that is being done on the ground?
So Fahraaz, I think when one thinks back to the first 15 or so years of our democracy, it was a moment, these were moments of high levels of enthusiasm, of hope. And, in the legislature, we had outstanding people with strong capabilities, with strong ideals and moral principles, with very clear ideas about what they wanted to accomplish, even though, of course, it was our first experience in a formal legislative process. And I think a lot was achieved at that time by the people who were in government at all levels, local, provincial, and national, across the country. Country moved forward, the economy grew, democratic institutions were set up that were functioning well. I remember, working with people like Jabu Mulaketi, Trevor Fowler, Amos Masondo, Bazima Shiloa. It was really a very rewarding experience, those 15 or 20 years. And we accomplished, I think, quite a lot in laying some of the basic foundations of a democratic society. And of course, the public mood at the time was very positive, very hopeful. So I don't think we had much of a sense that we were being challenged by too many obstacles. I think the mood then was of progress, of being able to get things done, of creating new institutions in our own, with our own, based on our own values and convictions and the goals that we had for our society. Of course, we're in a different moment, very different moment now.
Professor, you mentioned different moment now. When you, of course, took on the role of MEC for Community Safety, there were high levels of crime, probably not the highest levels that we are dealing with now. So, how would you assess your time as the MEC? Obviously, you had it in the final term of President Thabo Mbeki, and of course, when former President Jacob Zuma took over, you of course retained that position under Paul Mashatile. So how would you assess your role then? And of course, given it now, it's obviously two completely different worlds, that the high levels of crime continue to rise given where we are in this country at this moment.
So I recall, there were very high levels of crime. I recall when I made the statement that the levels of crime were unacceptably high, it had a lot of traction because the public appreciated the fact, I think, that I was acknowledging the facts, being truthful about the situation that we were confronting. And I tried to be as transparent as possible. I think I was the first provincial MEC to have quarterly report backs in public, reporting back on police statistics and so forth, so that we could actually see, and the public could see, whether we were making progress or not. And in those days, as I say, I think a lot of was accomplished before I took office. I think I was amazed by what was achieved in setting up victim support centers for women who had experienced abuse. It was an amazing initiative. I mean, I visited some of these facilities. The one that was most impressive was in Braamfontein, that Nomvula Mokonyane had actually set up, where they had the most advanced, comprehensive facilities for women who had experienced domestic violence and so forth. It was an extraordinary achievement, I think. In my own, when I was the MEC, there were a couple of things that stand out. I mean, it was very stressful because there were high levels of crime, and of course there's then a lot of public pressure, a lot of public concern. The media often gave me a hard time. But I would say that three things stood out. The first was that we introduced a system of data collection and analysis of policing in the province, which gave myself and my department a strong basis to engage with the police constructively and productively about crime patterns. You know, we could tell them our information is showing what is happening at the Lenasia police station. And I could then ask questions about what you're doing and what could be done to reduce the levels of crime and improve the levels of safety. So that rigorous day-to-day analysis of crime patterns, of station performance, and so forth, enabled the department to make effective interventions from time to time, and we assisted the police to deploy their resources more effectively and to implement actions which were meaningful. The second was that, and this to some extent was outside the mandate of the provincial government, because the provincial government was a civilian oversight body. We didn't have the same extent of executive authority over policing as the national minister does. But because I had a strong relationship of trust then with the late Commissioner Naidu and his team that had been built up over time, I said to him that, look, I think we need to concentrate on the violent crimes that are impacting people's deep sense of insecurity. For instance, house robberies. You might recall that we had very, very serious incidents, people being tyrannized in their homes, a lot of car hijackings. So we put together, we put together a strategy together with them of setting up focused task teams that didn't have other responsibilities in policing but could focus on these trio crimes. We got them to agree to set up what we called a war room, maybe that's not the best description, to bring all the files together of outstanding cases of armed robbery, hijacking, and so forth, so that the police could analyze docket by docket. First of all, how much investigative work had been done. I mean, we found that there were certain dockets that were basically very little detective work had been done, but we had enough information to look at the patterns, because this is syndicated crime, and then to have targeted actions by these experienced groups of detectives. And it's been published, the results were published. We achieved significant reductions in high-level violent crime in those three areas, up to 20-30% over a 2-year period. So, I think strategic policing does work. And then thirdly, I thought that the community policing forums in many of our areas were often not very functional because they became quite contested, quite political, um, and not all of them. There were many community policing forums that were very effective because they had elected competent leadership, but there were many that were dysfunctional. So I then decided that, based on the experience of because I visited KwaZulu-Natal and also the Western Cape, and learned from them, and then we set up and recruited 30 to 40,000 community patrollers particularly from informal settlements where there's no private security. People can't afford private security, but they have high levels of crime. And we trained those people, gave them a sense and identity, trained them so they understood their roles. You can still walk around in Gauteng and see the State Take Charge campaign. And of course, there was a communication angle to it. And I think it worked. It worked very well in those communities.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Firoz Cachalia. We're going to be discussing the role that he took up within the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, serving as its chairperson. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. In September 2022, Professor Cachalia began a 3-year term as chairperson of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which was created by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Its aim was to prevent and eradicate corruption and state capture, including guiding government's responses to the findings of the Zondo Commission. Prof, when you, of course, took up this role, I mean, saying it's a juggernaut of a role will be probably saying it in mild terms. Through all of the findings that you were able to get, did you really think that corruption in this country was as bad as maybe we had seen at first hand?
Okay, so I'm going to try and give you a detailed answer because I think this is an important question. So firstly, the role of the council was to advise the president. So it's not an implementing body. Advise the president on the implementation of a policy framework, what was called the all government, all of society policy approach that had been adopted by the cabinet about 2 years ago. Now, what informs that policy framework is one that I embrace. I think it's the right policy. The right policy in the sense that it understands that the response to corruption must be a comprehensive one. That it's not limited to law enforcement after the fact, that you needed prevention, you needed to involve society, you needed to involve a range of institutions. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail if that's of interest. So the president says to us as a council, I want you to advise us. So our terms of reference were that the president wanted us to advise him on how the overall, what he called the architecture of anti-corruption could be strengthened, which stretches from, in one sense, from the Department of Education to the NPA, to the DPCI, which is the main policing structure charged with the responsibility to investigate criminal corruption. So what needs to be done to strengthen them? He asked us to advise him whether new institutions, new anti-corruption institutions needed to be established. And in our midterm report, we came to that conclusion. We looked at the architecture and said, yes, Mr. President, we think you should establish what we called an OPI, the Office of Public Integrity, with a range of functions, because we came to the conclusion that corruption is also a systemic problem. I mean, you can go to by systemic, we mean a whole local government might be affected, or its procurement systems might be corrupted. or you can go into Tembisa Hospital where, we've had very serious problems. We've even had assassinations. But it's very clear that in Tembisa Hospital, the problem is not that you just have bad apples. The problem is that the system has become corrupted and that there are tenderpreneurs who are controlling officials in the hospital, who are corrupting tender procurement systems, and so forth. So you need an approach to identifying areas of systemic corruption, and then to dismantle them. So we have made that proposal to the president to establish such a body. I can again go into some of the details if we have time.
Yeah, no, sure, Professor, because I want to touch on obviously some of course, what was in those findings. A lot of the public, and I think they have every reason to be, is when we look at the Zondo Commission, there hasn't, of course, been prosecutions. Now, of course, the council that you were the chair of is acting in an advisory role. So obviously, that's as much as you can do. You've gone ahead and reached your limit there. But I mean, surely the public has every reason to feel a bit aggrieved, given that there hasn't really been any supposed prosecutions of those names that have been featured in the Zondo Commission. Given that, of course, there's also question marks with regards to the NPA. Just your comment on that, Prof. Cachalia.
Okay, so the Zondo Commission made recommendations for institutional reform. Let's leave that aside because they came to a similar conclusion as the council. They did refer evidence of possible criminal corruption. They identified several high-ranking individuals, and they referred those matters to the NPA for further investigation because they did not investigate those matters. They did not present the NPA with cases that were ready for prosecution, but they suggested that the prosecution might be warranted following further investigations. Now, it is correct to say that many of the cases that were referred, there's been very limited progress. Okay? But what is not correct is to say that there haven't been significant prosecutions. And some of those prosecutions have been successful and others have not. Which should be a warning also for us to put pressures on the NPA to bring cases before court which are not yet ready.
Sure.
I would also make the point that the area of state capture weakened those institutions, hollowed them out, so that now the challenge is to restore their capabilities. And the council that I had the privilege to chair has looked at that matter of ways of strengthening the investigation and prosecution of criminal corruption. I think that's an ongoing challenge. It's the one that the country expects us to win, and it's going to take political leadership to ensure that we build the capabilities. I would say this: we need an FBI-type capability in South Africa.
We had something like the Scorpions, Prof. I mean, we had something like the Scorpions, something a bit similar to that. Is that something that we should look at again? Of course, it was disbanded when President Zuma came into office. Do you think that's something we could maybe look at?
We are looking at that, and so some steps in that direction have already been taken. The establishment of the IDAC, the Independent Investigative Unit in the NPA, is a step in the direction of establishing something like the Scorpions without reproducing its mistakes. And the council, in its closeout report, is looking at the relationship between IDAC, which is in the Department of Justice, and the DPCI, which is headed by General Labia in the police, that is investigating both corruption and organized crime. And we're looking at how to integrate these institutions if necessary, so that the country ends up with a strong institution that can focus on criminal corruption. But that proposal hasn't been finalized. We are closing our report at the end of August. And I would say that that's our closeout report, end of August. That's when our term comes to an end. And because I'm now in the position of being the minister, I will be at the beginning of August. That department, I think I'll be in a better position to take those proposals forward.
Prof. Cachalia, before we go to the break, some of the findings, but I just want to focus on one of the findings that could potentially lead to a stronger national prosecuting authority. A lot of question marks with regards to that specific organization. How important is it, along with your findings, that whatever happens to the NPA, that it gets the strengthening, number one, and of course, the bolstering in terms of resources to make sure that prosecutions which are necessary, not just for the safety of this country, but giving the citizens a sense of hope that we have an NPA that will stamp their authority when it comes to high levels of corruption, and number two, of course, cases which need specific attention.
There is no doubt about that. And so I think the challenge before us is to ensure that we have competent, high-level detectives who can deal with complex crime. Corruption is a complex crime. It might sound easy to investigate and to prove in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. It isn't. But we need the investigators who have the competencies that will enable them to bring cases before the NPA, that are prosecution ready, that the NPA can take to court. And we need prosecutors who can win, often against clients who are well-resourced, often with ill-begotten gains, and supported by expensive, experienced counsel. So that's the challenge before us. We as a council have said that the NPA has to have a greater level of independence from the Department of Justice, so to ensure that they can prosecute without fear or favor. One of the proposals that I think the country needs to consider is that the detectives need their own dispensation. At the moment in the police service, the only way to climb the ladder upward is through management, right? But I think the detectives should have their own dispensation. They should be able to achieve mobility, including the improvement in their salaries and so forth, by the excellence of their work. We have a number of excellent detectives currently whose only option for mobility at the moment is to become commissioners, national commissioners, and so forth. So that has to change. The recruitment practices, the human resource approaches within SAPS will have to change in order for us to get to the point where we can investigate corruption more effectively than is the case now. Although I have to say that there are pockets of excellence. We have excellent detectives. There are people who are also doing an excellent job. It's often not visible to the public, but my experience in the council and as an MEC gave me clear indications that we have a lot to work with. It's not like we're starting from scratch.
After the break, I wrap up my conversation with Professor Firoz Cachalia. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back. I'm about to wrap up my conversation with Professor Firoz Cachalia, the incoming minister or acting minister of police. I beg your pardon. Prof, you were mentioning, of course, the good detectives that are out there. And I will agree with you on that, because we do have honest, not just South African police officers, but we also have honest individuals that are in law enforcement authority. How do we then find that balance, using, of course, the reports that are in the advisory council to make sure that the corruption that has infiltrated the criminal justice system, and of course the law enforcement authorities has that perfect balance?
Well, that's the challenge before us. Once I'm sworn in, I will engage in a process of consultation to understand how best to achieve those objectives. And I can't really say much more than that at the moment, because I haven't been sworn in, haven't had an opportunity to engage with senior management. And we do have an incumbent minister acting in that position at the moment. So I'll be much more able to have a conversation with that level of detail on those kinds of issues once I've been sworn in and I've had an opportunity to form some opinions about the way forward.
Prof, of course, you've mentioned, and of course, prior to the interview, you did say that you cannot speak until obviously you have been sworn in as the police minister. But I'm sure you're going to be keeping an eye on Minister Gwede Mantashe just to get a feel of how this role is going to be. And that's something that excites you, isn't it?
Yes, I'm excited. I'm up for the challenge. I think I'm going to be watching Minister Gwede Mantashe for the next 2 weeks very closely. He's a formidable leader, very tough, and so it will be a hard act for me to follow in his footsteps.
Prof, public confidence is low right now, I think on all fronts, except obviously our sporting teams that are doing quite well. But how do like individuals like yourself that are going to take on such an important position within the security cluster to say, here's our chance to, not just reinvent the wheel as South Africans to create a safer country, but also to make sure that there is confidence within us as South Africans. And of course, South Africans by nature are an enthusiastic country, enthusiastic bunch. We are very positive about a lot of aspects. So how do we make sure that positive spirit is reverberated across the country, especially from a safety and security perspective?
Well, let me give you a roundabout answer, if you don't mind. I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the work of Ibn Khaldun.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so great historian in the Islamic tradition, wrote a great text examining the various cycles of rejuvenation and decay in the Islamic world. And I've taken his insights to heart, because it's very clear that all societies, not only Islamic ones, go through cycles. And the important point is that history, and I think our faith, teaches us to work for renewal, to work for justice. It's not going to fall like manna from heaven. We are in a dark moment right now, and moving forward is going to take all our energies, the energies of well-motivated, ethical leaders who are there in abundance. I still believe that, in all political parties, and of course in our society. Our people are tremendously resilient. We've got what we're achieving in sport. We can achieve in our society. We've had moments of great darkness. I remember the 70s, for instance, the 80s. We had a great moment of optimism and renewal for the first perhaps 2 decades of our democratic transition. And now we're experiencing a moment of darkness. It will come to an end. It will come to an end if we remain optimistic, if we remain engaged, if we remain positive.
Prof. Cachalia, just any final words before we close off this discussion?
No, those are my final
Okay,
words.
no problem, no problem. Prof. Cachalia, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much. All the best ahead of your role. We hope to speak to you again, of course, when you are sworn in and are fully engaged as the acting Minister of Police. Absolute pleasure having you on. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
That is Professor Firoz Cachalia. Of course, he will start his position as the acting Minister of Police on August the 1st. Well, that's all we have for you here on Talking Point. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.